The room was electric before the first word was even spoken. Cameras buzzed, reporters leaned forward, and somewhere in the background, the hum of whispered anticipation felt louder than thunder. This wasn't just another political exchange. It was the kind of moment that lives in headlines, replayed endlessly on phones, televisions, and feeds across America. Stephen Miller adjusted his tie with the same cold smirk that had followed him through years of controversy. He leaned into the microphone, voice sharpened like a blade, and let loose a line that instantly poisoned the air. Immigrants, he sneered, were the greatest threat to America's stability. The words dripped with arrogance, laced in the familiar cadence of someone who believed cruelty was strength. The audience reacted with a visible shudder. Some gasped, others shook their heads in disbelief. It wasn't just what he said, it was the gleam of satisfaction in his eyes as he said it. For a heartbeat, it seemed as though Miller had seized control of the room, commanding attention with the audacity of his contempt. But in the corner of the stage, Jasmine Crockett sat perfectly still. Not a flinch, not a twitch, not even the faintest crack of emotion on her face. She let the words hang, let them echo through the chamber, as if she understood that silence was sometimes the sharpest weapon of all. The contrast was stark, one man puffed up on anger and disdain, the other presence in the room, a calm storm, biding her time. The moderator shifted uneasily, papers rustling. The audience looked from Miller's sneer to Crockett's unshaken calm, waiting, almost pleading for a response. She didn't rush. She didn't give him the satisfaction of an immediate counter. Instead, she allowed every second to swell with suspense until the tension felt unbearable. Because Crockett knew something Miller did not. She knew that when arrogance makes its loudest noise, dignity only has to whisper to cut deeper. And when she finally leaned forward, drawing a slow breath before speaking, the entire chamber seemed to hold its breath with her. What came out of her mouth next would ignite a political firestorm, a mic drop heard across the nation. But first, the stakes had to be revealed, and the battle lines drawn. This wasn't just a clash of personalities, it was the collision of two Americas. The one Stephen Miller insisted on clinging to, and the one Jasmine Crockett had spent her life defending. The room may have looked like a simple stage, two figures facing one another with microphones and prepared notes. But beneath that stage ran the currents of history itself. Every immigrant family who had crossed borders for a better life, every child who had grown up balancing two languages and two worlds, every voter who wondered if dignity still had a place in politics, all of them were silently present in that room. Stephen Miller had made a career out of provocation. From his earliest days in the Trump White House, he had crafted policies and speeches designed to stir division, to make fear into a kind of currency. His statement tonight was just the latest in a long string of insults aimed at immigrants, at people of color, at anyone who didn't fit his narrow definition of America. To him, it wasn't personal. It was strategy. If he could make people afraid, he could make them obedient. But across from him sat Jasmine Crockett, a figure who embodied the very opposite of fear. Her story was not of exclusion, but of belonging. Not of gates locked, but of doors opened. She wasn't just another politician responding to another insult. She was a daughter of determination, a voice that carried with it the weight of communities that had fought too hard to ever be silent again. That was why this moment mattered. This wasn't a fleeting soundbite or a headline for tomorrow's paper. It was a showdown over the identity of America itself. Would the stage belong to the sneer of arrogance or to the steady strength of dignity? The audience knew it too. You could see it in the way people leaned forward, phones raised, ready to capture history in real time. Every second grew heavier because the stakes weren't abstract. They were personal. A single mother watching from her living room who had crossed oceans to give her children a better chance. A college student scrolling Twitter, tired of feeling like their heritage was treated as a liability. A grandfather who had marched decades earlier, watching to see if the fight he thought was finished was still alive today. And yet, Miller carried on, as if unbothered. He doubled down, warning of an America overwhelmed if people like Crockett had their way. His words were dressed in policy jargon, but the intent was raw. Strip away belonging, redefine who counts as American, and turn fear into law. The camera panned to Crockett, still calm, still composed, but behind her eyes burned a fire that Miller couldn't see and wouldn't understand until it was too late. Because her answer wasn't going to be about him. It was going to be about every person who had ever been told they didn't belong, about every voice silenced in the name of power. The stage was set. The stakes were no longer theoretical. They were flesh and blood, memory and hope, history and tomorrow colliding in real time. And as Miller leaned back with his smug grin, convinced he had cornered the conversation, Jasmine Crockett finally leaned forward. The moment had arrived. But before she spoke, the story of her opponent had to be fully revealed, his rise, his contradictions, and the darkness that had brought him here. Stephen Miller had never been the kind of man who thrived in sunlight. His influence grew in shadows, behind closed doors, in hushed strategy meetings, in draft memos that stripped dignity from human lives and reduced people to policy bullet points. To the public, he was a name they occasionally heard in passing, often paired with words like hardline or controversial. But inside the machinery of Washington, Miller had carved out a role for himself as an architect of fear. From his early days, the signs were clear. While other students debated ideas for a better future, Miller seemed obsessed with defending a past that excluded more than it embraced. Classmates remembered him not for his brilliance, but for his unyielding certainty that diversity was a threat, not a strength. He carried those convictions like a badge, sharpening them into weapons long before he had the platform to use them. That platform came in the form of the Trump administration, where Miller found his stage. He was no longer just a fringe ideologue whispering theories. He was writing the very words that shaped presidential speeches. The travel ban, family separations, the constant rhetoric of us versus them. Miller's fingerprints were all over it. In his world, cruelty was not an unfortunate side effect of governance. It was the point. Every headline that sparked outrage was, to him, evidence of victory. He thrived on the backlash because it meant he had succeeded in forcing the conversation onto his terms. Yet for all his bravado, Miller was never truly comfortable in the public eye. Unlike politicians who craved applause, he carried himself like a man who relished the role of puppeteer. When he did step forward, it was often with that same detached smirk, the look of someone convinced he was the smartest man in the room, untouchable in his arrogance. His critics called him cold, soulless, even dangerous, but his allies saw him as indispensable, a strategist willing to go further than anyone else, to say what others were too cautious to say out loud. And that was what made him such a formidable villain in this story. Miller wasn't the kind of opponent who lost his temper or blurted without calculation. Every word he spoke was deliberate, designed to provoke, to trigger, to dominate. He understood the media cycle better than most, and he weaponized it with surgical precision. To him, Crockett was not just a political adversary, she was a target, a stand-in for the diverse, determined America he spent his career trying to diminish. But here lay his contradiction. For all his planning, all his mastery of rhetoric, Miller was blind to the very thing that could undo him, the power of authenticity. He underestimated how deeply Americans longed for voices like Crockett's, voices that didn't come from privilege, but from lived struggle. He thought dignity could be drowned out by noise. He believed compassion was weakness. He convinced himself that fear would always outweigh hope. Tonight would prove him wrong. The stage lights caught the sharp lines of Miller's expression, the rigid way he carried himself, as though posture alone could project dominance. But the cameras also caught something else, a hint of discomfort, a flicker of defensiveness, as though some part of him sensed he was facing not just another debate, but a reckoning. because this time the room was not on his side. The murmurs, the shifting of the audience, the piercing eyes of millions watching from screens, they weren't leaning toward him. They were waiting for her. And Miller, in his arrogance, didn't realize the danger. He thought his backstory, his credentials as the ruthless strategist of an entire administration gave him the advantage. He thought intimidation would silence. But dignity has a way of turning silence into a weapon, and Crockett was about to wield it. Before she could, though, the audience needed to know who she was, the story of resilience, the fight that shaped her, and why she was the perfect opponent for a man who thrived on fear. Long before Jasmine Crockett stepped onto that stage, long before the cameras ever caught her steady gaze or the headlines called her unshakable, she was a daughter of grit and purpose. Her story did not begin with privilege or easy access. It began with determination, the kind that comes from watching injustice up close and deciding again and again to fight back rather than fold. Growing up, she witnessed what it meant to struggle and still press forward. In classrooms where students were underestimated, in neighborhoods where opportunities were scarce, she learned early that the world didn't hand out fairness evenly. But instead of swallowing silence, she sharpened her voice. She discovered that words could cut as deep as policies, that speaking truth, even when unwelcomed, could be a shield not just for herself, but for others who had no platform. Law school became her forge. While many sought prestige, Crockett sought purpose. She wasn't interested in joining the ranks of those who maintained the status quo. She wanted to dismantle the barriers that had defined so many lives around her. Cases involving the voiceless, the marginalized, the overlooked became her focus. She defended clients who had nothing but their dignity to carry into court. And in doing so, she built her own reputation as someone unwilling to bend in the face of intimidation. Politics wasn't her first ambition, but injustice has a way of dragging the unwilling into its arena. When she saw communities stripped of resources, when she saw leaders who spoke only to the privileged few, she realized her voice needed a larger stage. And when she entered public service, she brought with her not the polish of an insider, but the raw fire of someone who had lived the struggles she spoke about. Her colleagues quickly learned Crockett didn't flinch. Whether it was on the floor of the legislature or in late-night committee hearings, she met arrogance with poise, ignorance with clarity, and hostility with unbreakable composure. Supporters began to describe her not simply as a politician, but as a force. She wasn't the loudest in the room. She didn't need to be. Her presence carried weight precisely because it came from authenticity. And authenticity is the one thing Stephen Miller never understood. For him, politics was theater, lines rehearsed, outrage scripted, cruelty calculated. For Crockett, politics was personal. It was about her neighbors, her family, her community. It was about the single mother struggling to keep food on the table, the immigrant child translating for their parents, the veteran who fought for a country that sometimes forgot his name. When she spoke with all of them behind her. That was what made her the perfect counterweight to Miller. He represented exclusion, the narrowing of America into walls and categories. She represented expansion, the widening of America's promise to include those so often erased. Every experience she carried, every courtroom battle, every late-night policy fight, every moment she refused to be silenced, prepared her for the confrontation that now looms before her. It's important to understand that Crockett didn't walk into that room with just her own reputation at stake. She carried the weight of generations, ancestors who had been told to sit down, who had been told their voices didn't matter. She carried the hopes of young people scrolling their feeds, waiting to see if someone, anyone, would finally stand up to the arrogance that seemed to dominate the political stage. She carried the stories of immigrants who still believed in America despite being told they didn't belong. And maybe that's why, when Stephen Miller unleashed his calculated provocation, Crockett didn't flinch. She had faced worse than his words. She had faced systems designed to erase her. Laws written without her in mind, rooms where no one expected her to win. She knew how to turn silence into strength, how to let arrogance expose itself before delivering the kind of response that left no doubt who truly held the power. Her journey was not about personal ambition. It was about survival, service, and the unrelenting belief that America's story wasn't finished yet. And on this night, she knew her role wasn't just to defend herself. It was to remind the nation that dignity still had defenders, that arrogance could still be defeated, that truth, when spoken with courage, could cut deeper than any insult hurled in hate. So when the cameras turned toward her, when the murmurs of the audience swelled into anticipation, Crockett leaned forward not just as Jasmine Crockett, the Congresswoman, but as Jasmine Crockett, the embodiment of every voice long ignored. The moment had come for her to face Stephen Miller not as one politician to another, but as dignity personified against the sneer of arrogance. And as the room held its breath, the clash began to escalate. The air grew thick with tension as the formalities fell away and the exchange turned raw. Stephen Miller, emboldened by years of being treated as the intellectual backbone of a movement, pressed forward with the kind of arrogance that comes from believing you've never truly been challenged. His words came sharp, clipped, delivered with the cold precision of a man who thought fear was the highest form of persuasion. America cannot survive, he declared, voice dripping with disdain, if we continue allowing people who do not share our culture, our values, or our heritage to flood across our borders. He let the word flood hang, as if human lives were no more than a natural disaster. His gaze darted toward Crockett like a challenge, daring her to interrupt, daring her to lose composure. But she didn't. She waited, calm, steady, her eyes locked on him, not in anger, but in the kind of unflinching patience that unsettles even the most confident opponent. Miller mistook that patience for weakness. He leaned further into his attack, layering policy jargon with overt insinuations, suggesting that leaders like Crockett cared more about outsiders than real Americans. His voice grew louder, but she didn't. She waited, calm, steady, her eyes locked on him, not in anger, but in the kind of unflinching patience that unsettles even the most confident opponent. Miller mistook that patience for weakness. He leaned further into his attack, layering policy jargon with overt insinuations, suggesting that leaders like Crockett cared more about outsiders than real Americans. His voice grew louder, more animated, punctuated by the self-assured gestures of a man convinced the audience would applaud him for his boldness. The audience, however, was not applauding. Murmurs rippled through the room. Some shook their heads, others whispered in disbelief. A few phones went up, recording every word, every gesture. Miller didn't notice. He was too caught in his own performance, too intoxicated by the sound of his voice. Crockett finally shifted, leaning toward her microphone. She didn't interrupt him. She simply adjusted her papers with deliberate care, the faint rustle amplified in the silence between his sentences. The gesture was small, but it spoke volumes. She was ready, and she was unshaken. The moderator attempted to step in, to balance the exchange, but Miller brushed aside the intervention with another volley. "If this continues," he said, his tone sharpened into a sneer, "we will lose our country. People like Representative Crockett may smile and speak of compassion, but compassion doesn't build nations. It destroys them." The line landed like a slap. Gasps erupted from the crowd. For a moment, the stage lights seemed to burn hotter, the room shrinking into a crucible of conflict. All eyes turned to Crockett. Would she snap back? Would she raise her voice to match his? Instead, she remained composed. Her silence was louder than his shouting. The contrast was undeniable. Miller's rising volume, Crockett's steady calm. It was the image of arrogance trying to overwhelm dignity, and dignity refusing to bend. Behind the cameras, the control room sensed it too. Producers gestured frantically, urging their crews to stay tight on her face. Something was about to happen. Everyone could feel it. And then, as Miller finally paused to catch his breath, Crockett leaned in. Her voice was calm, low, but filled with steel. The kind of voice that doesn't just answer, it dismantles. The room stilled. The audience leaned forward. Even Miller, for the first time, blinked. This was the moment, the pivot where tension would give way to revelation, where all his arrogance would meet the quiet force of truth. What she said next would not just respond, it would redefine the entire debate. And it would leave Stephen Miller grasping for footing he no longer had. Jasmine Crockett did not rush. She let the silence do the work Miller never could. While he fidgeted with his papers, his smug expression faltering under the weight of anticipation, she breathed slowly, deliberately, as if to remind everyone watching that dignity never panics. When she finally spoke, her words carried the weight of stillness turned into power. "Stephen," she began, her tone calm but edged with a quiet authority. "What you call a flood, I call families, mothers, fathers, children, people who believe in this country enough to endure pain most of us can't imagine just for the chance to contribute to its promise." Her words cut through the room like a blade. The audience stilled, every eye fixed on her. She didn't look at Miller. She looked out toward the crowd, toward the cameras, as if speaking directly to every living room and phone screen across the nation. "You call them outsiders," she continued, her voice firming. "But tell me, who built your roads? Who harvests the food that ends up on your table? Who cares for your children, cleans your hospitals, protects your communities in silence? Immigrants are not America's weakness. They are America's backbone." Miller shifted in his seat. The smirk that had seemed cemented to his face flickered. He opened his mouth as if to interject, but Crockett pressed on, her pace steady, her rhythm deliberate. "And here's the truth you will never admit. The America you cling to is shrinking because fear cannot outlive hope. You can write all the memos you want, craft all the policies you desire, but you cannot erase the contributions of millions. You cannot erase their dignity. And you cannot erase the fact that this country is stronger because of them, not in spite of them." Gasps filled the room, followed by scattered applause. The moderator tried to quiet the crowd, but it was too late. The momentum had shifted. Crockett's voice had cracked the veneer of Miller's dominance, and everyone knew it. She turned to him now, eyes sharp, tone unwavering. "You talk about compassion as if it's weakness. But compassion is not weakness, it's courage. It takes courage to look at someone different from you and see their humanity. It takes courage to welcome, to integrate, to share. What you call destruction, I call democracy in its purest form. And what you call weakness is the very strength that has carried this nation through its darkest hours." Miller shuffled his notes again, forcing a chuckle that landed flat. He muttered something about open borders, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. Crockett seized the hesitation. "Do you know what destroys nations, Stephen?" she asked, leaning in now, her tone sharp as steel. "It isn't compassion, it's arrogance. It's the belief that cruelty makes you strong. It's leaders who weaponize fear because they are too small to inspire hope. That is what destroys nations. That is what history never forgives." The audience erupted, applause and cheers flooding the chamber despite attempts to maintain order. Phones shot upward, capturing the moment. Twitter timelines were already being written in real time. Crockett didn't raise her voice to match the energy of the room. She did the opposite. She lowered it, forcing every ear to strain to catch her words. I am here tonight not because I believe America is perfect, but because I know it can be better. Because people who look like me, people who come from where I come from, people who arrive on boats or planes with nothing but faith in this country, they keep believing in America, even when America tries to forget them. That's not destruction, Stephen. That's devotion. Miller sat frozen, his jaw tight, his eyes darting toward the cameras as if searching for a lifeline. But there was none. Crockett had done what few ever managed. She had turned his sneer into silence. She leaned back now, just slightly, her face calm, her hands folded. The effect was devastating. She had spoken, she had dismantled, and now she waited, not for applause, not for validation, but to let the weight of her words settle like stone. The moderator, almost breathless, tried to regain control, but the room belonged to her. And then, in a final turn, Crockett delivered the line that would echo across the country. You may try to define who belongs in America, Stephen, but America has already decided. It belongs to all of us, every color, every culture, every story of struggle and survival. That's what makes us who we are, and no fear of yours can take that away. The eruption that followed was not just applause, it was catharsis. People leapt to their feet, clapping, cheering, shouting her name. Online, hashtags lit up instantly. Hashtag Crockett crushes Miller. Hashtag mic drop moment. Hashtag America belongs to all. Clips of her words spread before the debate had even ended. And Stephen Miller? For the first time in years, he looked small. The architect of division, silenced by the very dignity he had spent his life mocking. Yet, as the crowd's roar carried on, as Crockett's words rippled far beyond that room, the true shockwaves were only beginning. Because what happened in that chamber wouldn't stay confined to a single night. It would explode across the nation, into living rooms, newsrooms, and timelines. The battle was over, but the aftershocks, those were just beginning. The debate ended, but the real drama was only just beginning. Outside the studio, the night air buzzed like static, as if the country itself was holding its breath. Reporters huddled in tight circles, their phones lit with breaking notifications, each one racing to push the headline first. But no matter the outlet, the story was the same. Jasmine Crockett had not just won the debate, she had redefined it. Within minutes, clips of her takedown spread like wildfire. On TikTok, users stitched her lines into remixes, the phrase, America belongs to all of us, flashing across screens over swelling music. On Twitter, the hashtags trended in unison, turning her words into a rallying cry. On Instagram, Reels looped her mic drop moment again and again, each caption more defiant than the last. It wasn't just politics anymore, it was culture. Meanwhile, Miller sat in a back room, scrolling through his own mentions, his pale face illuminated by the glow of a phone he could no longer control. The smirk he had worn so effortlessly on stage was gone. His team whispered around him, trying to spin, trying to salvage, but the tide had already shifted. Every meme, every headline, every quote belonged to Crockett now. Cable news anchors who had once written her off as a fiery but fringe figure suddenly spoke her name with reverence. A star-making moment, one commentator declared. The night the narrative changed, said another. Even conservative outlets struggled to find their footing, some resorting to labeling the audience biased, others desperately trying to clip Crockett's words out of context. But the full video was already everywhere, and context was her greatest weapon. In living rooms across America, something deeper stirred. Immigrant families watched together, tears welling as they heard, perhaps for the first time in years, someone with a platform speak their truth without apology. Farm workers crowded into diners, replaying the clip on someone's cracked phone screen. Nurses on overnight shifts streamed the video between patients. Young activists, long cynical about politics, found themselves inspired again. And for communities that had lived under the shadow of Miller's policies, the separated families, the detained children, the asylum seekers pushed back at borders, this wasn't just a speech. It was vindication. It was proof that dignity could stand against cruelty and win. Back in Washington, party operatives scrambled to assess what had just happened. Some saw Crockett as a rising force, a voice too powerful to sideline any longer. Others feared the establishment wasn't ready for the storm she was about to unleash. But for the people, none of that mattered. What mattered was the resonance, the feeling that finally someone had spoken with fire and truth, and the world had listened. The numbers confirmed it. By dawn, Crockett's mic drop had amassed millions of views across platforms. Hashtags tied to her speech had been shared by celebrities, athletes, even musicians weaving her words into their sets that very night. Grassroots organizers flooded her office with calls, emails, and donations. Volunteers signed up in droves. And then came the stories. Mothers posted videos of their children repeating Crockett's words, "America belonged to all of us," in tiny, defiant voices. DACA recipients uploaded testimonials about how her speech gave them hope they hadn't felt in years. Veterans of color shared their own journeys, reminding the nation that they too were part of the fabric Miller tried to deny. But the most powerful stories weren't online. They were whispered, repeated, felt. In neighborhoods where immigrants had long felt invisible, people walked a little taller. In classrooms, students debated her lines as if they were poetry. In church basements and union halls, her words were quoted like scripture. And while Crockett herself retreated from the cameras that night, refusing the circus of instant interviews, her silence only added to the weight of the moment. She let the people tell the story for her. She let the movement breathe. Yet in the shadows, Miller plotted. He was not a man who accepted defeat, and humiliation only sharpened his resolve. His allies murmured of a comeback, of doubling down, of twisting Crockett's triumph into a new attack. He would not vanish quietly. But for now, the stage belonged to her. And as America woke the next morning, scrolling through feeds, replaying clips, whispering her words to themselves, the sense was unmistakable. Something had shifted. This was not just a debate. It was the spark of something larger, something unstoppable. The question now was simple. Would the country fan the flames or fear them? When the frenzy of the night gave way to morning calm, Jasmine Crockett finally stepped forward, not into the glare of another studio, not into the pit of punditry, but into the quiet weight of reflection. She stood before a modest podium at a community center, where the walls were decorated not with cameras or lights, but with the faces of everyday people, immigrants, veterans, parents, children. And there, she spoke not as a debater who had won a moment, but as a citizen who had lived the struggle. "Last night," she began, her voice steady, "wasn't about me, and it wasn't about him. It was about us, all of us standing together against the idea that dignity can be denied by arrogance. I didn't come to trade insults. I came to remind this country of its promise." The room was silent, not out of hesitation, but out of reverence. Each word carried the weight of lived truth. She spoke of her own journey, not as a polished soundbite, but as a reminder that her story was intertwined with millions of others, a family that had endured, a community that had believed, a country that had tested her at every turn. And yet, she stood unbroken. The moral was clear. America's strength had never come from the loudest voices of division. It came from the quiet resilience of those who worked, sacrificed, and loved this country enough to demand it live up to its ideals. "Arrogance wants us to believe that cruelty makes us powerful," Crockett said, her gaze steady. "But dignity is what endures. Dignity is what outlives fear. And dignity belongs to every one of us, no matter where we come from, no matter how we pray, no matter what our names sound like." The crowd erupted, Not in the roar of a campaign rally, but in the deep, sustained applause of recognition. They weren't just clapping for her, they were clapping for themselves, for their families, for their place in the American story. Even those watching from afar felt it. Viewers live streaming from small towns, cities, and rural fields sensed the shift. It wasn't just politics, it was identity, validation, belonging. And yet, even as her words brought comfort, there was no denial of the challenge ahead. Crockett didn't sugarcoat. She warned that arrogance does not fade quietly, that Miller and men like him would regroup, strike back, try again. But she framed that reality not as fear, but as a call to stay united, to stay dignified, and to never allow hate to dictate the future. Last night, she said, wasn't the end of a fight. It was the beginning of a movement. The phrase landed with finality. The camera lenses that had snuck into the back of the hall captured the moment, and by the time the sun set, that line was etched into digital memory, trending across platforms, painted onto posters, even scribbled onto homemade signs, and marches springing up across the country. Because in Crockett's closing words, the story had shifted once more. This wasn't just about a debate stage. This was about the timeless struggle between dignity and arrogance, between truth and deception, between America's promise and its betrayal. And though the villains still plotted in the shadows, though the road ahead promised storms, one truth was undeniable. Crockett had given her people something arrogance could never steal: hope. And hope, once sparked, spreads like fire. What no one could predict, however, was just how far those flames would reach next. The echoes of that night still reverberated, not just in headlines or viral clips, but in hearts. Jasmine Crockett's stand was no longer a moment. It had become a marker, a line in the sand between arrogance and dignity, between exclusion and belonging, between silence and the power to speak truth. And for millions watching, the takeaway was clear. This wasn't just her story, it was theirs. Every immigrant family who had ever been told they didn't belong, every worker who had been overlooked, every child who had felt invisible, every American who believed that justice and equality were not optional, but essential. Crockett had given them a voice, but the movement could only grow if those voices joined together. So the question became, what will you do with this moment? Will you let it fade into memory, another clip buried under tomorrow's noise? Or will you carry it forward, share it, speak it, live it, until dignity drowns out arrogance once and for all? Because the truth is this: America's story is being written right now, and every person who shares, who speaks, who stands, becomes an author of that story. If this moment moved you, if it lit even the smallest spark inside you, don't let it die here. Share this message, subscribe, stay connected, be part of this community that refuses to be silent. Together, we are more than watchers. We are builders of a future where dignity is louder than hate. This isn't just a video. It's an invitation to belong, to resist, to hope. And the story we tell next, that's up to you.